This is a brief analysis of W.B.Yeats's sonnet Leda and the Swan, focusing first on its classical allusions and then on its meter. W.B. Yeats is a very prolific early 20th century Irish poet, and Leda and the Swan is one of his most famous poems. It's about an infamous episode of Greek mythology, and just as a trigger warning, you should know that it contains very brutal imagery of sexual violence. Yeats describes a scene of Zeus, the king of the gods, transformed into a swan as he rapes Leda, a beautiful princess. Zeus was notorious for this, transforming into animals in order to pursue and to rape beautiful women, and such stories very often accounted for the origins of famous children, demigods who would live influential and significant lives. Here is the poem itself. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs. Her nape caught in his bill, he holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? After the rape, Leda gives birth to two children. The first is Helen, who becomes the captive of Troy and who is thus the cause of the Trojan War. The Trojan War was the subject of Homer's epic, the Iliad, written some 3,500 years ago, the most famous war in ancient history, really, because of the many thousands of adaptations, reimaginings, and episodes that were centered around that conflict. One of which is in lines 10 and 11 of this poem, the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. The wall surrounds the city of Troy. The Greek commander Agamemnon leads his men to burn the towers of Troy using the Trojan horse, which is not mentioned here. It was a giant, hollow wooden structure in which the Greek soldiers were hiding until the Trojans broke their own walls to bring it into the city. Leda's other child is Clytemnestra, who became the wife and later, in some versions, the murderer of Agamemnon. After the war, he returns home and is murdered either by his wife or by her lover. This image is of their son Orestes killing her in vengeance. Yeats is suggesting that all of these events happened because of this moment that he describes in the sonnet, Leda's conception of the sisters, Helen and Clytemnestra. So much for the allusions, but what can we conclude about the meter of this poem? That is, its arrangement of syllables. This image of my scanned, hastily annotated copy may not really do it justice, but my sense of the meter of this poem is that it's highly irregular. Typically, you would expect a sonnet to be in the meter of what's called iambic pentameter. That is, alternating stressed and unstressed syllables, which are called iambs, comprising 10 syllables per line. For example, this prologue to Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. Look at the fourth and fifth lines here. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. That is textbook iambic pentameter. And it's definitely not what you see in Yeats's poem. Most of it is iambic. You can see there are alternating unstressed and stressed syllables, but there are some significant variations. By the way, the point with meter is not, frankly, that every variation is terribly significant. There are some arguments that really stretch credulity in that direction, but that the point is that the variations in the pattern call attention to verbal structures that have some quality in common. You can see here, for example, his force on her, the great wings beating, the dark webs, and the strange heart beating. Those are all very forcefully emphasized phrases. You also see her weakness as she struggles to resist him, using words like terrified and loosening. And finally, the weakness of his indifference at the end, the indifferent beak. And so those are unstressed syllables. Thus, the violence of this poem and the violent deaths that this rape is going to cause is figured in the irregularities of its meter.